precious. The definition of precious is of great value, not to be wasted or treated carelessly. Isn't that a fitting definition of time? I would argue that time is one of the most precious things that exists in the world today. How many of you have ever wished for more time? I think that we could all say yes to that. More time in a single busy day. More time in a lifetime. More time to finish a project when the deadline is looming. More time with your kids who seem to have grown up way too fast. My youngest child just finished kindergarten, and I have been asking myself repeatedly in the last few weeks, where did the time go? You will never have more time than you do right now at this moment. Time is always ticking. Time is precious, and we realize that when we suddenly find ourselves running out of it. Time and the way we keep time is a very important aspect of the Bible and Christianity. Time itself was created by God for people. God himself stands outside of time, but we as humans are defined by time. We all make our presence in the world at a particular time and at a particular place in history. How we spend our time and what we do with the days that God has given us shows a lot about who we are and what our priorities are. Time was established by God from the very beginning. The biblical account of creation tells us that God created the world in 6 days, and that on the seventh day, he rested. Whether or not you believe God created the world in a literal 6 days, this 7-day cycle has become a very familiar pattern for us known as the week. Dave has been working through a sermon series on the theology of work called The Other 6 Days. Today we are going to be talking about the 7th day, which became known as the Sabbath. You might be wondering why I started off this morning talking about time if my sermon is on the Sabbath. I started this morning by talking about time because I do believe that time is precious. And I also believe that the key to making the most of the time that God has given us lies in the Sabbath. I know the Sabbath is not the most popular topic of discussion in the church today. I read a book last summer called The Rest of God by Mark Buchanan. In this book, Mark says to his readers, "You probably tend to see the Sabbath as something archaic and arcane, something from which you're exempt, something that, like bloomers and corsets and top hats, went out of style long ago and is not likely to make a comeback soon. That is probably how some of you tend to see the Sabbath. I know I have seen it that way at times." Mark goes on to say, "I hope to convince you otherwise, that Sabbath, in the long run, is as essential to your well-being as food and water." I also hope to convince you otherwise in my sermon this morning. I hope to convince you that the Sabbath is essential to your well-being. But not just that, I hope to convince you that the Sabbath is essential to how you keep time. That the Sabbath is essential not just as the 7th day of the week, but as that which gives life and meaning to all the days of the week. Time is precious, and the key to using your time wisely lies in keeping the Sabbath. We live in a very busy, fast-paced culture. I would even go so far as to say that we live in a culture that prides itself in busyness. We boast about the hectic pace of our lives and feel good when others marvel at how we are able to keep everything going and juggle so many balls in the air at one time. Busyness is a fact of life over which we often feel we have little control. In a culture that prides itself in busyness, rest is seen as laziness and a waste of time. When I was a kid, I liked to read a lot. I was often teased by family members being called a bookworm. I would often get pestered to put my book down and come and do something. Apparently, reading a book didn't count as doing something. In our busy culture, taking time to do things like reading a book or doing a puzzle, another favorite pastime of mine, is often viewed as being lazy and wasting time. Perhaps this is part of why the Sabbath is not a popular topic of discussion in our culture. Spending a whole day resting just sounds so wasteful, doesn't it? There is so much to do and so little time to do it. Well, I am going to argue this morning that to make the most of the time that God has given you, you are going to have to waste some. Which leads me to my main point. To keep time well, you have to waste time. Yes, you heard me right. I'll say that again. To keep time well, you have to waste time. If you have your Bibles, you can open them to Exodus chapter 20. And I'm going to read verses 8 to 11. So this passage is when Moses is receiving the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. And so this morning I'm going to read the fourth commandment to you. So chapter 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. The word Sabbath comes from the Hebrew word for rest. As God rested on the seventh day, so too people need to rest. When I was teaching a class the other day upstairs with the kids, we were reading a book about what God is like. And the book mentioned that God is never tired. And immediately one bright 7-year-old boy put his hand up in the air, and he pointed out to me that on the seventh day God rested. And then came the obvious question, why did God need to rest if he never gets tired? It's a pretty good question, right? We get lots of good questions upstairs from the kids, I assure you. It caused me to stop and think, why does God rest on the seventh day? It's true, God doesn't get tired. He doesn't have a physical body like we do. There is no need for him to rest. We could probably come up with several reasons why God rests, but I think one of the most important reasons is that God is establishing a pattern of work and rest that he knew would be very important for us, and that would become central to the life of his people. God knew that to keep time well, we were going to have to waste time. I want to be clear here that when I say waste, I don't really think that keeping the Sabbath is a waste of time. I say waste because our culture generally views resting and worship as a waste of time. And keeping the Sabbath is countercultural. So from our cultural perspective, yes, we need to waste time. Exodus 20 verse 8 says, remember the Sabbath by keeping it holy. When something is holy, it is set apart for the purpose for which it was created. This pen, for example, it was designed to write. The purpose of this pen is to write. So this pen is holy when it is being used for writing. Well, the purpose of the Sabbath is that it has been set apart to the Lord for rest. And so we can keep the Sabbath holy by using it for rest and for worshiping God. So that gives us two purposes for the Sabbath. So the first purpose for the Sabbath is to rest. And the fourth commandment, which is often associated with not working, is not so much a warning away from working as it is permitting people to rest. There are not a lot of very specific rules in the Old Testament surrounding the Sabbath and what it means to rest. There's one main command, you shall not do any work. And what that command meant changed a lot as Israel changed from a nomad nation that traveled around living in tents to a more established and commercial nation. The second purpose for the Sabbath is that it is a day which is set apart for God. And Jewish people begin celebrating the Sabbath at noon on Friday, and it goes for 24 hours, at sundown on Friday until sundown on Saturday. And so they would begin the Sabbath with sundown on Friday with a joyful fellowship meal. And then the following day on Saturday, text would be read from the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, the prophets, and a psalm. It was a day of total rest and a time for the community to focus its attention on worshiping God. This was a whole day spent wasting time. But to keep time, you have to waste time. The Israelites did a pretty good job of keeping the Sabbath until around the time of the Babylonian exile. And in the Old Testament, keeping the Sabbath is closely associated with keeping the covenant. When Israel stops observing the Sabbath, they are a nation in trouble. Around the time of the exile, one of the prophet's main complaints about Israel is that they have not kept the Sabbath. After the exile, the Israelites began to keep the Sabbath again. They had learned their lesson. So when Israel stops taking time to keep the Sabbath, they are in trouble. And then after the exile, part of becoming a strong nation again was giving their time back to God by keeping the Sabbath. To keep time, you have to waste time. Remember, I said in the Old Testament that there weren't a lot of rules governing the Sabbath, just one main command: you shall not do any work. But by the time Jesus arrives on the scene, things have changed quite a bit. The guidelines and regulations regarding the Sabbath had become a very strict set of rules called the Halakha. The Pharisees were a group of Jews who were known for enforcing these strict rules. They were more concerned with not breaking the Sabbath than with keeping it holy or set apart. Jesus is known for his conflict with the Pharisees over the Sabbath. Many Christians today would argue that you don't need to keep the Sabbath because Jesus himself did not keep the Sabbath. Jesus' conflicts with the Pharisees regarding the Sabbath center around the strict set of rules from the Halakha. There is actually no hard evidence that Jesus himself broke any command from the Old Testament concerning the Sabbath. To understand how the Sabbath has changed with the coming of Jesus, we need to understand Jesus' relationship to the Old Testament law. Jesus says in Matthew 5:17, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." In other words, Jesus didn't come to get rid of the Old Testament law, but to fulfill it or make it complete. So now we need to ask, what does this look like when we apply it to the Sabbath? As we established before, the purpose of the Sabbath is for rest and worshiping God. These two purposes are now fulfilled or made complete in Jesus. Jesus says in Matthew 11:28, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." What is Jesus saying? He's saying, if you are weary and burdened, if you are struggling under a heavy yoke, if you are too busy, if you feel like life is too much, if the troubles of this world are weighing you down, he says, come to me, and you will find rest for your souls. Come to me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Go waste some time with Jesus. Learn to rest in him, and suddenly you will find that your burdens are not quite so heavy. Not only does Jesus tell us to come to him to find rest, but Jesus models this for us throughout his life as he repeatedly seeks out solitude to spend time alone with God in prayer. I'm going to look at just two examples of this morning, but there are many throughout the Gospels. So the first one we're going to look at is Matthew chapter 14. You can turn there if you want. It's Matthew chapter 14, verses 22. I'm going to read 22 to 25. And so this little section that we're going to read, it takes place right after Jesus has finished feeding the large crowd of 5,000 people and right before Peter walks on the water. So verse 22. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. So in this passage, we learn that Jesus was there praying from evening to shortly before dawn, so for a good part of the night. And this is right after Jesus has spent the whole day talking to people, healing their sick, feeding them. He was probably pretty tired. And his disciples are out on a boat in the lake, caught in a storm. And Jesus Jesus' first priority at that moment is to spend time praying with God. Another example of this is Matthew chapter 26. And I'm not going to read this passage this morning, but it's verses 36 to 46, because most of you are quite familiar with this passage. This is when Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, right before he faces his trial and death. Jesus knows what is about to happen to him, and again he seeks a quiet place to pray. He knows before he can face what lies ahead that he must surrender his heart to God. The result is that Jesus faces his trial, beating, and death with an almost eerie calmness that causes people to stop and take notice and say, surely he was the Son of God. Like I said earlier, our culture prides itself in being busy. But I don't know if any of us could claim to have a busier schedule than Jesus did in his 3 years of ministry. Yet Jesus repeatedly takes time to rest in God, to keep the Sabbath, and the result is a renewed resolve, strength, and peace to face whatever lies ahead. Jesus demonstrates to us that to keep time well, you have to waste time. Although Christians in the early church were freed from the regulations regarding the Sabbath, they still maintained the weekly 7-day cycle. Although at some point Christians changed from worshiping on Saturday to worshiping on Sunday, which became known as the Lord's Day. This change was probably made quite early. There is no record of any Christian group that did not worship on Sunday. The New Testament itself has 3 possible references to the observance of Sunday. I'm not going to read them this morning, but they're on your handout and you can look them up later if you'd like. The switch was made from Saturday to Sunday because Jesus rose on Sunday. Sunday observance became a celebration of the resurrection. It was like a mini Easter celebration each Sunday. The early church set aside Sunday as a day to recall the living, dying, and rising of Christ, and a day to anticipate the future kingdom when we would get to celebrate with Jesus in heaven. The author of Hebrews also emphasizes the importance of rest when he writes, "There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For those who enter God's rest also rest from their own work, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest." The purpose of the Sabbath is to rest and worship God. And although the early church recognized that things had changed since Jesus came, and that Sabbath keeping might not look quite the same as it did in the Old Testament, they also recognized that rest and worship were just as central to the Christian life, both individually and as a community. The early Christians knew that to keep time, you have to waste time. So why should we keep the Sabbath today? I'll start by telling you why we shouldn't keep the Sabbath. You shouldn't keep the Sabbath because it is a command or set of rules you must follow. When we do this, the Sabbath becomes burdensome, much like with the Pharisees, which was not the intent of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was meant to provide time for rest and worship. You should keep the Sabbath because God set a pattern of work and rest when he created the world. And because God emphasized the importance of rest when he commanded the Israelites, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. And Jesus, although rejecting the strict rules associated with the Sabbath, demonstrated the value of rest by continuously seeking out solitude and time alone with God. And finally, the early church, although freed from the Old Testament laws regarding the Sabbath, set aside Sunday as a day to worship and remember what Jesus had done through his life, death, and resurrection. We saw what happened in the Old Testament when the Israelites stopped keeping the Sabbath. They were a nation in trouble. Is not the same true for us? When we stop spending time with God and worshiping with other believers, it is a sign that our relationship with God is in trouble. How can we get our relationship back on track? By keeping the Sabbath, by taking time to rest in God, and by worshiping with other believers. So far we have established that time is precious, and that to keep time well, you have to waste time. At this point, some of you may be thinking, but I don't have time to waste. Remember that busy culture we talked about? I am living in it. We are all living in it. And time is precious. We can't waste it. Time is precious, that many of us do lead very busy lives. But as I stated in my introduction, how we spend our time shows a lot about who we are and what our priorities are. If we don't have time to keep the Sabbath, time for rest and worship, then maybe our priorities are a little out of whack. An author I read asks the question, are we not often so preoccupied with our own activities and plans that we find it difficult to appreciate the gift of rest? I'm going to read that question one more time. You can ask yourself this question. Are we not often so preoccupied with our own activities and plans that we find it difficult to appreciate the gift of rest? Does that ring true for you? I know I find myself there sometimes, when I feel guilty for taking a break. I have a hard time resting because I feel like there is something I must be doing. Some of us tend to struggle with this more than others, but the reality is we all need rest. You may feel like you don't have time to waste, but as I stated earlier, resting is not wasting time. When we take time for rest and worship, it adds meaning and richness to the rest of our lives. It helps us to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. To keep time, you have to waste time. This concept is countercultural for a culture that feels, I don't have time to waste. How many of you, after spending time doing something that our culture would consider wasteful, has had someone say to you, how do you find the time to do that? As if you are somehow privy to a secret portal that affords you more time than the rest of us and gives you the luxury of having time to waste. Mark Buchanan says that in a culture where busyness is a fetish and stillness is laziness, rest is sloth. But without rest, we miss the rest of God. The rest He invites us to enter more fully so that we might know Him more deeply. This is what the Israelites knew as they set aside one day each week to rest, worship God, and remember all the ways that God had cared for them. And this is what the early Christians knew as they gathered once a week to remember and celebrate what Jesus had done for them through His life, death, and resurrection. And this is what Jesus knew as He regularly sought out God through solitude and prayer. I would also like to point out that although our culture tends to pride itself in being busy, there are still many ways in our culture in which we can observe the value of rest. I'd like to point out 3 examples of this for you. One is that schools have regular break times, especially in elementary school. In fact, Finnish schools have now started giving their students a break every 15 minutes because studies have shown that it increases productivity. Sports teams have built-in break times and rest times through substitutes, breaks, and timeouts. Many of us have mandatory break times at work. Our culture says, I don't have time to waste. Just keep going. There's no time to stop. And yet we see the value of rest and the value of taking a break in so many aspects of life. If we see the value of taking a break at school, at work, when playing sports, then doesn't it make sense that we would need to take a break in our spiritual lives as well? That we would need time to rest and be refreshed. Mark Buchanan also says that busyness robs us of knowing God the way we might. But sanctifying some time adds richness to all time. You might say, I don't have time to waste, but I say, you don't have time to not waste time. I want to challenge each one of you this morning to give your time to God first. Give your time to God first. Sanctify some time, and everything else will fall into place. We often take this approach with money in the church. There are probably many of you sitting here today who could tell a story about a time when you didn't have a lot of money, when it was really hard to give to God, and yet you gave anyways, and then miraculously found that you had more than enough. I think the same is true of time. Give your time to God first, especially when you don't feel you have any extra time to give, and you will find that you have more than enough. I learned this lesson when I was a student doing my undergrad at Houghton College. My first couple of years at college were a little bit stressful. I had to make a lot of adjustments and learn how to adapt to my new environment. One lesson I learned very well during that time was the importance of spending time with God and of keeping a Sabbath rest. One of the challenges of being a student is that the work is never done. You finish one paper, meet one deadline, only to be confronted with the next one. But sometime during my first couple of years of school, I realized this, and I started being intentional about taking a Sabbath rest for myself. This was a 24-hour period each week where I would not do any schoolwork. I found that this was quite a revolutionary idea for a student. I was the only one doing it. I found it too hard to take a break on Sunday evening, because sometimes I would need to study for a test on Monday morning or finish an assignment that was due. So I started setting aside time from supper time on Saturday to supper time on Sunday as my rest period when I would not do any schoolwork. I would go to church, I would hang out with friends, I would spend time with God, and I wouldn't feel guilty about it. I can continue to do this throughout the rest of my undergrad and through my years at seminary. And I can tell you, I never regretted it, not once. I will also tell you that my grades did not suffer for it. In fact, it made me a better student. When you give your time to God first, when you make Him your priority, everything else falls into place. Now, before you go away thinking I have this all figured out and that I'm an expert at wasting time, I want to make it clear that I struggle with the command to keep the Sabbath probably as much as any of you. There are times in my life when I have done this really well, and there are times in my life when I have struggled. In fact, I found it quite ironic that I was working on this sermon on the Sabbath at the same time as I was preparing for VBS, which just happens to be the busiest time of year for me. I have had to try very hard in the last few weeks to find some time to waste. But writing this sermon at this very busy time has challenged me to make sure that I'm giving my time to God first, to make sure that I do find time to waste, especially at the busiest time of the year. I also want to make it very clear that keeping the Sabbath today does not necessarily mean setting aside Sunday or a 24-hour period every week as your day of rest. Keeping the Sabbath can look quite different for different people. For example, some people work shift work, where they work nights, or they might work something like 4 days on and 2 days off, so that their days off are always changing. As a mother of young children, I have found Sabbath keeping very difficult. Taking time to rest is not easy when you have little ones around that demand your attention, sometimes around the clock. Sometimes we have to get creative in our Sabbath keeping, in finding time for rest and for worship. But make God a priority. Give your time to God first, especially when you are busy or in a stage of life that makes finding time for rest and worship challenging, because we all need the Sabbath. I also think that there is a trap that we can fall into sometimes as Christians, and this is when we start confusing people with God. As Christians, we know that we are called to love everyone and to share the good news. As a result, we try our best to live lives of love, lives of sacrifice where we put the needs of others above our own. We give of ourselves, often giving of our time. And this is a wonderful thing. The trap that we can be caught in, though, is when we start to replace God with people. When people or tasks become more important than God. When we give our time to people first and God second. As Christians, we must always remember that the goal of our life is not people, it is God. So give your time to God. That last quote was a quote from the book, The Way of the Heart by Henry Nouwen. This is one of my all-time favorite books. It's a fairly short book, and I have read it several times. One of the reasons I love this book is because it reminds me that it is okay to take time to rest. That resting and seeking solitude is countercultural, but so necessary to the life of a Christian. Nowlan talks a lot about the value of solitude in this book. And one of the things he says is that solitude molds self-righteous people into gentle, caring, forgiving persons who are so deeply convinced of their own great sinfulness and so fully aware of God's even greater mercy that their life itself becomes ministry. When we have found our rest in God, we can do nothing other than minister. God's rest will be visible wherever we go and whoever we meet. When we give our time to God first, when we learn to rest in Him, then His love flows out of us, and we can do nothing other than minister. Time is precious, but to keep time well, you have to waste time. We often think, I don't have time to waste, but give your time to God first, and everything else will fall into place. So go waste some time this week.